Hello and welcome to the final episode in our series all about psychological flexibility. I'm Dr. Richard McKinnon. I'm a chartered psychologist and coach, and I am joined once again by my co-host.
Hello everybody, it's Ross McIntosh here, organisational psychologist and coach. Richard, I can't believe it's the season finale.
I love how you put it that way. Yes. I mean, this has gone by really quickly. And for listeners who don't know what we're talking about, we've been doing a series all about this skill set called psychological flexibility. We've now covered all the skills. But what we wanted to do is have an episode like this where we could just wrap up, share our thoughts, and also answer some questions that have come through. Because we've been recording this over a period of months, we have had time in between where we've received some emails, we've had some questions at workshops. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to answer those as well. I'd like to start though with what it's been like for us to do it. Any thoughts or reflections on what it's been like to spread this out this way? Because I know when you normally train, it's a much more condensed experience. We've been doing this for a long period of months. How has it been for you?
It's been such an interesting exercise. It's been something I look forward to when we have our recording sessions, because we each do a little planning and reflection beforehand. And as you say, I would never introduce the Hexaflex to a workplace audience, because I think it can involve us getting our audience to a really cognitive place where they're trying to understand, when I really want them in my style of training to experience the processes of ACT. So it was really interesting on that front. And one of the tools I use in ACT is the ACT matrix, as you know, and that's all about perspective taking. And I think doing this deep dive with you and our two differing, complementary perspectives have really expanded my approach, my knowledge, my skills in each of the ACT processes. So I've loved doing it. I'm sad it's coming to an end, but I suspect there'll be more coming from the house of McKinnon and McIntosh in the future.
That sounds like the name of a horror film or something. But yes, I would agree.
I was thinking more like House of Elliot, two seamstresses making divine gowns. But
I just pictured a Hammer horror film from the 60s. It shows what's going on in our minds. I mean, I really enjoyed this as well. And what I've been thinking about actually is, because we've been doing this over months and months, the space in between has been really useful for me to reflect on, of course, editing these things as well. Get to hear it over again and get to see the video and how it's landing with people, so that we're kind of iterating and we're revisiting. Whereas for the vast majority of my podcasting career, for those of you listening, I just did that in inverted commas, it's a one and done. Here's an episode on this topic and it's done. Whereas this is the longest series I've done where we've been focusing on the same theme. So it's been a different experience like that. And I'm either interviewing a technical expert or subject matter expert, or someone's asking me things, whereas this has been very different. We're bringing two different perspectives, two different lives of professional experience, and as a result, I've learned a lot. So it's been great, and it's been good fun. It's been really good fun. So thanks for making the time. And yes, we are at the end, but no doubt we'll have further collaborations, I'm sure. More on that a little bit later. So we've had some feedback. We've had some questions from listeners and viewers. So what we thought we'd do is I'm going to start by addressing this one in particular that we got, because I think it's a really important question to be able to answer, and it pulls on a few different things. And I also had the same question come through on the YouTube channel as well. So I've put an answer there, but I'm just going to pull up my notes here so I can actually read the question in its entirety. So with this lovely email in, first of all, let me tell you and Ross that your podcast concerning ACT, which is another way of describing this framework, are the absolute best. You have explained this concept better than I've ever heard. How does one apply this skill to having done things in the past that went against their values? there were circumstances that led them to do what they did, and those things have been corrected. How does one move forward without the negative self-talk of you should have known better, or what were you thinking, that keeps playing over and over in their head? End quote. So a really lovely feedback. Thank you so much. And a really interesting question, because pretty much I think all of us have examples where we can look back, and maybe one of the first things would be, what were you thinking when you did that? You know, how did you do that? So I've answered this from a couple of perspectives. First of all, that's a regret. I regret something about my behavior. So they're just thoughts about the past. They're memories. So it can be useful to note them as a memory, and therefore we can use the skill of diffusion that we've been talking about. Any of those approaches that enable us to step back from it a little bit, maybe label it specifically as being a memory, neither good nor bad, rather than something that we have to do something with. Oh, there's that thought, I need to do X. No, that's a memory. And that memory doesn't really help me in this present moment I'm in. So that leaning into that diffusion approach can be really helpful. I also made the point that when we look at the past, we can very, very broadly approach it in two ways. One is to try and learn from the past. And we're revisiting the past to identify what we can take from it and what we might do differently next time. Broadly speaking, I call that reflection. It's with a purpose. It's also, as we said in one of our earlier episodes, very easy to go back to the past and re-experience it, and all of the negative stuff that comes with that. So rather than reflection, that's rumination. So I mention this because it can be useful when we notice we've time traveled to the past. Whatever that episode was, am I reflecting to learn from it, or am I just going over it again? You know, around and around, and no good is coming from it. No line in the sand so I can move on. And actually, there's a further point here. You know, when we experience regret, it's might be difficult to hear, but that regret, that discomfort is a sign that our values are important to us, and we've stepped outside of our value set. We've maybe acted not in accordance with them, and maybe not intentionally, but it's something that happened. So it's a way of seeing the values as being important. And from this point on, we can say, now I'm going to try and put that into practice a little bit more. So it's a learning point. And actually, something we've said previously, all of these things are made easier if we're able to bring our focus to the present moment. So the more that we're able to practice that present moment awareness, it's easier to see regrets as memories. It's easier to practice that diffusion. It's easier to notice how we feel about our values and see the opportunities to put values into action in this moment. So we're less anchored by the past, and we're more focused on the present. So that in broad strokes was how I answered that question, and I put that in response on the YouTube channel. Ross, what do you think about that one?
Well, first I'll echo your gratitude for the kind words about this series. That's wonderful to hear. And also echo your response about noticing and learning. And in much of my work with groups and individuals, I'm looking to support them in cultivating a particular stance towards their noticing, noticing with it in a particular style, noticing with curiosity and compassion. So getting curious about having done things in the past that went against their values, that's a really interesting thing to reflect on, because I think it's something that will affect many, many people. Certainly me. And I'd like to focus in on that curiosity and kindness, particularly that kindness bit. And I want to take a brief tangent just to talk about compassion and some of the research on compassion, because I had a guy called Dr. Stan Steindl on my podcast, and he's an expert in compassion based in Australia. And he quoted a study. He talked about this study when I was chatting to him with nurses. He was working with nurses. And he actually thought, I can feel them being really hard on themselves. And he measured different flows of compassion. So there's a flow of compassion where you're giving compassion. There's a flow of compassion where you're prepared to receive compassion, and there's a flow of compassion where you're directing compassion towards yourself. You're giving self-compassion. And he measured this in nurses and found that, I would say unsurprisingly, they were higher than the general population in giving that compassion. It's what I would always hope for from any healthcare professional. But in terms of receiving or preparedness to receive compassion or self-compassion, they were lower than the general population. And these were nurses who were about to become qualified, and there was lots of nerves around, am I ready for this? This is important. People's lives could be at risk if I make a mistake. I might lose my qualification. I might lose my license to practice. And the reason I've gone on that tangent and shared that is that we could all be a bit better at offering ourselves compassion and being prepared to receive compassion. And it sounds like from what you described, you're looking back and you're noticing the circumstances at the time which impacted your behaviour. And it still feels like you're directing some negative self-talk towards yourself. And I wonder if it's time to just consider whether it's appropriate to start to let that go a little bit, let go of that grip. And as Richard was saying, that diffusion can really help us in terms of letting go of that sort of dominance or being pushed around by that thought. But I think that noticing that this has happened in the past, that taking that learning from it and the way we talk to ourselves. There's a wonderful psychologist called Kristen Neff who does a lot of research on self-compassion. And she would ask us, are we talking to ourselves in the way that we talk to a loved one? Someone we really care about in our life. The way we talk to ourselves, is that as if we were talking to someone we love, or is it perhaps harsher? And it sounds like in this case it might be harsher. So maybe it's just reflecting on those threads of compassion, and we'll pop some extra resources in the show notes for this episode, just to direct you to more information and exercises on compassion. Maybe just worth reviewing those and having a go.
Brilliant.
So that's.
I really like the sound of that, because that noticing with curiosity and compassion is the important kind of recipe there, isn't it? Rather than noticing and judging or labeling. Yeah, really, really nice. I hope that's been a helpful answer from both of us. Obviously, everyone will understand we have to kind of answer in general terms with questions, because we don't know someone's circumstances. So we just talk about how these processes, how these skills map onto different circumstances. Listen, let's move on to this next email we got. And it was a humdinger. I loved reading this. I really, really did love reading this. But Ross, do you want to take us through the main points?
Yeah, I'm going to read through some of the key elements of this email, but it was truly heartwarming to receive this. So it starts off by saying, I just wanted to say a big thank you for your podcast series on psychological flexibility, which has come at an ideal time for me. I'm an NHS paediatric consultant and have been off work with burnout since March. I've been a regular P Super for several years and found the series and back catalogue of My Pocket Psych through People Soup. And then, after some other reflections, I just wanted to focus in on this. I thought I would like to share a couple of variations on the tools that have helped me. Being childlike, some would say childish, I like Winnie the Pooh. There is a scene in the film Christopher Robin, starring Ewan McGregor, where Christopher Robin is trying to work on the train and Pooh is calling out all the things he can see out of the train window. Trees, bush, person. When asked what he is doing, Pooh explains he is playing a game called Say What You See. And Richard, I'd just like you to note that I desperately was trying not to do a Roy Walker impression there from that series Catchphrase, but I think we owe it to my listeners for me to butcher that phrase. Or shall I not? Say what you see. What's Mr. Chips doing? I apologise to everyone who that may have offended, and we can cut that
Especially
bit out.
the people of Northern Ireland.
Yes, yes. It's about the only accent I can do. So, or some may debate that. Anyway, back to Winnie the Pooh. Christopher Robin asks him to play it a little quieter, and so Pooh continues in a not-so-quiet whisper. I have found this game a good way of grounding myself in the present moment, and sometimes change it to say what you hear or say what you feel. I always add in a Pooh, what are you doing? And then whisper. I also add in a I don't know what that is, like Pooh does in the film. Beautiful.
Love it.
But I'll continue sharing the rest of this feedback. And the second example is adapted from Richard's sushi restaurant cognitive diffusion exercise. I don't like fish, so I've adapted it to the luggage carousel at the airport. I know Richard doesn't like airports. I imagine suitcases and baggage going round with my thoughts on things like you're not good enough, you've let people down. The patients would be better if one of the other consultants was on duty. I'm learning to leave the suitcases to go round and round rather than trying to take them off or get rid of them. I even say things like, that's the third time that suitcase has been around. I wonder where its owner is. And when there is lots of unhelpful baggage on the carousel, I am practicing noticing and saying, this isn't even my carousel. And it finishes with thanks again for this excellent series and People Soup and My Pocket Psych. Wow.
Fab. Even better than a question is someone taking this stuff and making it work for themselves. And it's something I always say about diffusion exercises. You can be really creative. And there are two great creative examples of taking something and running with it to make it work for you in your own context.
And in other parts of their email feedback, they talk about fun and playfulness. And playfulness is one of my values. And despite butchering an accent there, I do love to bring in playfulness to my work. I think it can help us access different perspectives. It can help us with problem solving. I don't have children, but sometimes relatives and kids of friends, watching them play, and the way they play with such imagination and without the boundaries we tend to develop as adults, can be really something awe-inspiring to watch. So I'm a big fan of playfulness. And I was at a conference, when was it? A couple of months ago, the European Academy of Occupational Health Psychology. And there's actually some research on playful work design, which I've got noted in terms of thinking about it for a future podcast episode. Again, I digress. But I think it sits alongside my response earlier of that curiosity, kindness. Why not try a bit of playfulness? We can become so immersed in events, situations, relationships in our lives, that sometimes playfulness can be quite diffusive. It can help us with that cognitive diffusion. And it can just help us reconnect with that childhood perspective, perhaps, in our lives. So that's a bit of a reflection from me. How about you, Richard? Any reflections on that?
I think that's a lovely point because, when someone wants to practice these skills, it can often be because they really feel they need to. There's something going on for them. They want to deal with maybe pressure, stress, difficult relationships at work. And actually everything feels important and feels like it, needs to be dealt with. Whereas a playful approach is a having a go approach, is seeing how you get on with it, treating it lightly, which is, I think, much more in fitting with the whole approach of ACT. It's not rules, it's principles. And I know some practitioners that will actively use playful approaches in diffusion, for example, using silly voices and fun phrases, because that's a lot lighter than some of the more demanding tone thoughts that our mind gives us. So I'm all for that. Obviously, it has to be authentic to the person. So what works for you works for you. And these are great examples. And what's really funny, I read this email, and I think within 48 hours, I saw the same example about the luggage carousel. Someone commented on LinkedIn. So I don't know the person, but they said that they view it in that way because it's another dynamic thing. And that's one of the things that really helps us. It's something that's moving, and we're not controlling it. We're observing, we're noticing. So it can be anything. And I just love that that's not even my carousel, which is a great way of, it really resonated with me because I'm winding myself up about a thing that's nothing to do with me. I'm getting caught up in thoughts about someone else. Let me focus on me being me and dealing with this. And while he's quite right, I don't like airports. I'm very clear about that. You know, what works for you works for you. It's memorable. It's simple. It's fun. I really like it.
Yeah. Yeah, so thank you for those.
Thank you so much. And we do love to hear from listeners and viewers. So a quick reminder, you can always email podcast@worklifepsych.com or ross.peoplesoup@gmail.com with your questions, your comments, your examples of how you're bringing this stuff to life, because that is great. Really great to hear. I'll tell you another thing that I did was pull together some questions I've had at workshops over the last couple of months. And obviously I provided answers live. I didn't say I'll answer that on the podcast, but I thought they were really good questions because they raised a bit of conversation in the room, and we could maybe look at them now. And I would put them in the category of frequently asked questions. I get them enough that I thought we'd bring them up. So the first one, can you, or indeed should you, change your values? What do we think about that?
Great question. And when I first read it, it feels, and it's one I've come across before as well. And I would say the should makes me a little bit uncomfortable. You can certainly change your values. I think what I'd heartily recommend is reviewing your values, because contexts can change around us. The context inside our head can change too. So I think it's worth reviewing our values. I think some values are a rich seam that go through different life areas and also are with us throughout our lives. It's like a rich seam of precious metal. And some arise and then go again with different life events or different chapters in life. Quite often with things like births, marriages, deaths, divorces. People can shift their values in quite a radical way, driven perhaps by those events or impacted by those events. So it's definitely worth checking in with your values to see what's changed and keep evolving. I think a lot of these questions we're reflecting on today are about evolving as human beings and learning. So I notice, just a little anecdote, sometimes I'll do a card sort, either with an individual or with a group, a values card sort. And sometimes people say, how many, and I get them to sort them into 3 piles, like super resonance, medium amount of resonance, and not much resonance. And people say, how many do I need in each pile? But I should be that, or I must be that. And I kind of say, well, I'm not interested in the good girls and the good boys in the room. Forget those societal pressures that maybe have told us we should be that or we must be that. I encourage people to go with their gut as much as possible, even though our mind wants to get involved. So I guess in a nutshell, I'd say I would recommend having a go at reviewing your values now and then, just to see if there's still a good fit. And like we say, maybe getting playful, trying on a new value to see if it fits a particular life event or a particular milestone you're facing. So that would be my initial response. How about you, Richard?
I mean, it's a really common question, and my ears sort of pricked up when you said societal pressures, because in my experience it often comes from that. Should I have this value on my list? You know, someone else mentioned it, now I think I should have it. Well, should isn't very helpful in this instance. It's not that this value is absent in your life, you weren't thinking of it when you were making some notes, it wasn't front of mind in your life at the moment, it doesn't mean you don't like that value or want it in your life, or you actively want to remove it from someone else's experience. But where you are in your life, these 3, 4, 5 things are what you want to guide your behavior. And to paraphrase what you said earlier, actually the way I explain it to delegates and coachees is that, look, at different points in life you're paying attention to different values because they resonate with that stage you're going through. You're not being inconsistent. You're developing, you're growing, and you're paying attention to, maybe it was fun and adventure when you were younger, and now it's things like stability and security. It doesn't mean you don't value fun, but it's not your number one motivator for making decisions anymore. You've grown.
Beautifully put.
Yeah, and actually, and I won't breach the confidentiality of the group, but actually this stemmed from a fundamental misunderstanding about values, and it was mixing them up with a belief system of rules, in which case that's not a value, because this rule was implying X will always be X and Y will always be Y, and X is better than Y, whereas that's not a value. You could say that's an ethical framework or a moral framework or a law, but values are about flexibility and options in our behavior and not being rigid into categories. But at the time, as it always does, it opens up a whole conversation about what values are. And one of the pieces of feedback I got in the room, which really resonated with me, is, well, we are just talking about words. I said, yes, until they're translated into behavior. They're just words. And in fact, the words we give the values doesn't matter as much as us doing the thing in life. And so we also don't want to get caught up too much with the words we use to label our values, as long as they make sense to us and as long as we're acting on them somehow. There is no one. Sometimes people feel there should be one chart, like the periodic table of values, but that's rigid. That's a rule-based system. We don't want that. Figure it for you. Revisit it. Amend what you've got on your little piece of paper. You decide this. It's not for anyone else to tell you what your values are. And it's a sort of a seam of conversation that always seems to pop up when we give values enough time in a workshop, where you leave the space for it.
That's the key, isn't it? Giving it enough time. Because just going back to that values card sort, because something else has popped up for me. I get them to narrow down the most important pile, because typically people have quite a few cards in that, like 30 cards. And when I say narrow it down to 5 or 6, some people are absolutely horrified. And I say to them, look, you're not choosing the values for the rest of your days. We're not going to have these carved backstage on a stone tablet that you then have to carry around with you. This is us going back to that P word, playfulness. We just want to get you used to experimenting with different values, trying it on, like we might try on a new pair of shoes or a new cloak, and don't know why, and just seeing how it feels, how it supports us in moving towards what matters.
Yep, absolutely. It's not a label that's going to haunt you for the rest of your days. You're just trying something out. So there's a whole thing about values. We spent a whole episode on it. We've actually, dedicated quite a bit of our conversation to it, but because it is kind of like the fuel for this stuff. It's the purpose and meaning, it's the sense of direction. And so the very strong advice is always take the time, please, to sit down and get that clear for yourself. And then it's a great source of activity. Yeah. Let's move on to the next question, because I loved this one. It's on a theme that we often get. Is daydreaming harmful?
Love it. Well, I would go back to our conversation when we were talking about noticing and awareness. and talk about autopilot and present moment awareness, that distinction, because I quite often get people to think about things they do in life on autopilot and things they do with more awareness. And I always say, and I'm going to repeat it now, I'm not knocking autopilot. Without autopilot, this daydreaming, we wouldn't have great inventions, great music, great choreography, great literature, great poetry, great architecture. This capacity for us humans to time travel in our minds and dream and discover is fantastic. It's just sometimes that daydreaming or that autopilot can overreach itself. And that mind wandering doesn't always result in a happy mind. Because sometimes we are, that word you used earlier, Richard, ruminating about the past or fretting or worrying about the future. So, harmful. So the wandering mind can be an unhappy mind, research shows us. And what I would always seek to encourage is noticing if we're in a daydreaming or mind-wandering state that's not useful, that's not functional for us or workable for us, and using the skills we can develop to step into the present moment. So I'm not sure if that answers clearly, but maybe if I could listen to your reflections too, Richard, it will help me think of anything else.
I think we're absolutely on the same page. I think it's contextual, isn't it? If you're sitting down with your cup of coffee and you're just thinking about holidays you've been on and enjoying the memories because it's your coffee break, how could that be harmful? Whereas if you're sitting in a very important meeting with a client and your mind is off to the same holidays, but you're missing what's being said in the room, I won't say it's harmful, but it's not helpful. And coming back to, what do you want to be doing in that moment? If you want to be thinking about something else, that's fine. But if you want to be paying attention, and if your interests are best served by being present in that moment, then it's not helping you do that. It's not a failing. It's not harmful with a big H, because daydreaming can serve many purposes and it can be really pleasant, you know. But if it's getting in the way of you being the version of yourself you'd like to be in that moment, then it's, as you say, come back to that present moment, using the present moment awareness to notice that you've drifted and to bring yourself back. That's often how I describe it to people, and they make that connection, because virtually all humans can identify with the moment when they've been daydreaming, they notice they've been daydreaming, and they manage to bring themselves back to the present moment. No one had to physically tap them on the shoulder. And that can be a bit of a light bulb moment for people when they say, oh, that's what you're talking about. I do that all the time. So this is not saying no daydreaming, never daydream, but is it getting in the way of something more helpful, more functional, or more necessary even? Not, it doesn't have to be fun, but something that just needs to be done in life. Then maybe not. Maybe it's not helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's look at our third question then, which I loved hearing this. We're explaining, for context, the concept between our options in any moment, when we can engage in what we call towards moves, which are behaviors in line with where we want to get to and the kind of person we want to be in our values, or away moves, when our behavior is purely to avoid or minimize some form of psychological discomfort. So it's avoidance, basically. And people can, in my experience, people can get their heads around that. It's different to pass fail, which is nice. It's different to good bad, which is nice. And it's contextual, which gives us flexibility. But at the same time, once you spot your away moves, the question was, how can I not feel guilty about my away moves? Once I know they're away moves, that's the implication here. So on the one hand, you might say ignorance is bliss, but actually the best thing that we can do from our development and our flexibility perspective is to notice these loops we can get stuck in, where the avoidance isn't helping us beyond momentary relief from something intangible. But actually, the way I put it to my clients is, especially early days, the more of these away moves you notice, the more gold stars you can award yourself, because you're noticing, which you didn't before. You're discriminating away from towards. You're noticing what the towards option could have been. So you're learning, you're moving more and more in the direction. It's not instantly turning off all away moves and only making towards moves. Recognizing that you're doing it and why you're doing it comes back to your earlier point about compassion for ourselves. I'm engaging in this away move because the alternative, well, I imagine it to be pretty awful. So of course I'm going to do that if I'm being compassionate to myself. And then actually it's about the steps in the direction of towards, not completion or ultimate success. So that's how I approach that when people ask about being guilty about them, or how can I never do any away moves anymore, or is it wrong to engage in away moves? It's not. Once you notice those options, you can learn from that. But changing the behavior, well, it's going to take some effort. Otherwise, we'd all have a little switch and we could click it and say, no more avoidance. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I love the question, how can I not feel guilty? And I would say cultivating your own psychological flexibility doesn't turn you into a saint who only ever does towards moves with a lovely halo glowing from around your head. We'll always do both. We'll always do towards, taking us towards the person we like to be, and we'll always do away moves, moving away from that discomfort, getting relief from that discomfort. And as Richard, I absolutely agree. If we can spot those away moves more frequently, we can use that as a cue. Oh, I've spotted an away move. What small step could I take in the next moment that would take me towards what's important in this context?
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about. And as you say, going back to that curiosity and kindness, we're becoming uber noticers with that stance of curiosity and kindness. If we can notice more away moves, then we can do something about it, rather than expending energy sort of feeling guilty or getting anxious or perhaps even angry. We can say, okay, I've noticed that with curiosity. Rather than being unkind to myself, what can I do in the next moment?
Exactly.
It might not always be easy. What can I do in the next moment that would take me towards, a little step towards who I really want to be? It might be something like, maybe you've stormed out of the room, Ross. Try, when you try and slam the door and it's on a sort of fire spring, so it doesn't slam. And you get out and you think, oh, Ross, what an idiot you are. A towards move could be just me going back into the room and trying to find a way to continue that conversation. Really thinking about who I want to be. Just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not the extinguishing of all of these things we don't like. It's noticing it and then deciding what we'll do differently instead. But I think this is one of the ways this is such a powerful skill set. It is about the small steps.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
also realizing when guilt, it's come up again. Guilt is just a thought. My mind is giving me a guilty thought. Fine. What do you want to do with that? You have a choice. You can sit with it and stew, or you can crack on and do what's important and meaningful to you. So I think these kinds of questions can be really useful when people road test this stuff. And for me, there's sort of two phases. One is, I get what you're talking about. Now I'm going to go and have a go. And now I've got more questions because I've tried to do this and I've hit the boundaries And now I've come back with more questions, which is fantastic. So I'll reiterate, do get in touch with your questions, your examples of putting this together. We love to hear from you. I'd love to wrap up this episode by touching on this point about how you can continue this journey, because it's not, unfortunately, it's not like being dipped in a big thing of paint or flicking a switch or unlocking something with a magic key. It's a journey, and we're all on it. But if you're in a sort of self-directed mode, you're listening or you're watching and you're thinking, I do want to do more of this, a few points to share with you. One is to revisit the episodes. Go back, have a listen, watch the video, fast forward till you get to the bit that's relevant to you, and keep going back until you've maybe found a phrase, a sentence, a way of saying it to yourself that sits with you. The why for all of this is really important. When we want to change our behavior, it's really important that we have a clear intention for that. What's my motivation for making this change? What difference will it make if I'm able to do a little bit more of this and a little bit less of this? When you experiment with the new habits, the new behaviors, practice noticing how it feels to do that. Now, there's a fine line here, isn't there? Because we're not looking for, I'm a new person as soon as I've done this one thing. But the noticing could involve, oh, well, that wasn't as bad as I thought. Or that was easier than I thought. Or that felt okay, and I'll do it again. There's no sort of moments of huge reinvention here, but practicing noticing how it feels to do these new things. And practicing ongoing reflection. I had a coaching session earlier today where we spent virtually all of our conversation talking about ways to reflect and capture that reflection and bring it to life and to treat it as a resource. And I got around to talking about reflection as a skill. And the more we do it, the better we get at it. The more we're able to find those nuggets of wisdom or those key lessons learned that we can bring to life later. So practice that as well. They would be a few key points for me. There's so many resources out there. There are so many ways that you can do this. There's no one perfect way, but it does take practice. Anything to add to that from your perspective, Ross?
Yeah, I think practice is one of the key words. It doesn't come magically, but practice with that attitude. I'll just recap on the attitude of curiosity, kindness, and playfulness. Consider yourself a scientist in the laboratory thinking, I wonder what might happen if I do that. And get curious about the results. Because for me, it will always be like tales of the unexpected. That other things will happen. We'll notice new things. And it can become a real habit and a joy to do this. It won't always be a joy, let me be clear, but it can become a stance we adopt in our perspective taking, our problem solving, our approach to challenges, the way we communicate with others. So it can serve us in so many ways. So yeah, playful experimentation with curiosity and kindness.
Now, that's for everyone who is developing themselves. We want to offer something else. So what I would like to trail is a new course we're going to offer, all about psychological flexibility. Now, I've reflected long and hard on how to do this because the majority of the PsychFlex training I'll do with groups is face-to-face with the occasional bit of distance work. But not everyone can do that. Not everyone is a member of a team or in a company where they're happy to do that. So I wanted to offer something that's self-directed but is also participative. So new course coming in November, and it will be a blended learning course with some e-learning to get your head around some of these key concepts, to prepare, to reflect, to identify your intention, to get everyone to this sort of level playing field of understanding, and then a series of live webinars with me, but also with Ross. And our focus, because the Work-Life Psych focus for the September to December 2024 is well-being. And so the focus of this course will be using psychological flexibility to boost your well-being in whatever way that's meaningful to you. And we'll spend a lot more time explaining and exploring that. So watch this space. We'll be flagging up in plenty of time how you can join us on the course, what you can expect from it, how it works, all of that stuff. But I know for every person that loves to sit and watch videos and direct their own learning, there's many more people that will just welcome the accountability involved in signing up for something and joining a group of people as they go through it. So I'm super excited because this is a new departure.
And me too, I'm super excited because it means the partnership with Richard isn't over. We get to play more, so that's great. And we were discussing the timing and we were thinking starting November this year. And I was thinking, just what a gift to yourself to sign up for something like that in preparedness for if New Year's are your thing, but in preparedness to land in January with some new skills and perspectives. What a treat. What an act of self-care.
And it is, being on a course is different to reading a book in so many ways. But what I would come back to is this distinction that I make all the time: knowing versus doing. Knowing is I get it. Doing is I'm practicing it. And being on a course like that enables you to get that live practice. Ask us the questions. Be part of a group that's going through it. And it could be one of you, it could be your entire team, it could be as many people as you want can join this. But I'll be sharing all the details, and they will eventually go live on the Psychological Flexibility Resources page, which we've been using for this series, which is worklifepsych.com/psychological flexibility. So the collab will continue. I'm very excited about that. And I'm very excited to be able to open it up to individuals rather than big organizations. And we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, a playful experiment, if you will.
Indeed. Ross, this is the end of this series. It's been, thank you. It's been an absolute delight. As I said, I've learned a lot. I've really enjoyed doing this. I've enjoyed the work in between, the reflection. It's been great to work with you in particular. And it's great to get the feedback we've had that people are using this, finding it useful. It's putting this out there is the whole reason, that we sit down and do this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Right back at you.
And thanks to everyone who's been listening and watching. We appreciate it, and we'd love to hear what you think. And if you are discovering this in some distant year and you've stumbled across it, the door remains open for you to let us know what you think and what questions you have, because I'd really like this to sort of be evergreen content. It's just out there, this series. So thank you for joining us. Hope you found it useful, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Yeah,
Bye for now.
Thanks, folks.